want you to know that my mom's here today. Um, my sister, Joyce, and brother-in-law Dick brought her because I was preaching. We've got a family connection, you understand, and because Mom was here, I decided to wear my green stole instead of purple one. She didn't make my purple stole. She made my green stole, so I'm wearing it. I have a purple shirt on if you're a fundamentalist. If you're a liturgical fundamentalist, I'm wearing purple. If you don't care about things like that, I've got the stole my mom made for me. So thank you very much. Mom's name is Ruth. I always knew her as Mom, strangely enough. Ruth was a name that I heard people call her, and it didn't have a great deal of significance to me, other than I knew that was the same as Mom, but not for me. I didn't call her Ruth. This awareness began to grow about what is Ruth, who is Ruth, and that connection made this book more interesting to me. And as I studied the Old Testament, I began to learn things like, well, the Jewish arrangement of the Hebrew Scriptures is different than the Christian arrangement of the Hebrew Scriptures, so Ruth is in a different place. It seems to us who are Protestants, it seems to fit better where it is. It doesn't really matter a whole lot. Now, I want to share with you that I am using as my own personal consultant in this particular sermon. I've preached a time or two from Ruth, but this is another one. This is a new one. And Kathleen Robertson Farmer is professor of Old Testament at Union Seminary. That's a United Methodist outfit in Dayton, Ohio. And I want you to know that this has to be fresh because when I was in seminary, there were no women writing about Old Testament, especially not as scholars. Things are different now. When I first went to seminary back in olden days, when we sang as a student body, it sounded like a male chorus, and it was. Now, more than half of the students in our United Methodist seminaries are women. So I want to celebrate that, and I want to remind you that the book of Ruth stands out because of its female name among a bunch of other books that have men's names. So just tuck those little bits of trivia into your pocket as we go through this story. The book of Ruth is a story about the changing of location. It's a story about moving about in a geographical world across borders that are pretty significant and actually begin to lose significance under certain circumstances. If you want to talk about hospitality where the plates don't have to match, you have to go through the book of Ruth. Period. If you want to talk about hospitality across geographical boundaries, you have to deal with the book of Ruth. Now, here's how it works. There was a famine in the land, and it was a significant enough famine. That means the crops weren't growing. People were not getting fed. It was a bad time. It was like the Dust Bowl in Kansas not too many decades ago. People were displaced because of hunger. Ruth and her husband and their two sons left an area that is familiar to us in our scripture reading They left Bethlehem of Judah, not far from Jerusalem, to go to a place where they had heard by the grapevine that the famine was not reaching. They went over to Moab. Now, it just happens Moab is across the river. Now, when we talk about geographical movement of people right here and right now, we hear things about a river. But the river they crossed was not the Rio Grande. It was the Jordan. And it was on the other side of the Dead Sea. They went over there, and apparently they got along quite well, because the two sons married Moabite women. They stayed there for 10 years, and all seemed to be going well. At one point, Ruth says, you know, I'm sorry, you didn't correct me. Okay, you didn't correct me. It's all your fault. Who was it that left Bethlehem? What? Naomi. How could I get that wrong? But I did. Come on. You've heard this story. Naomi and her two sons and her husband left Bethlehem. Are we going all right now? Okay. I'm not particularly good with names any more than I am with fundamentalism, and that may be the reason. So anyway, we got Naomi now in Moab. Fair enough? And one of her sons married a Moabite woman named Ruth. And now we're getting there. Now we're getting there. And what was the other daughter's name? Daughter-in-law? Remember, I'm hard of hearing. Orpah, which if you spell it differently is Oprah. I just thought I'd throw that in too. Orpah and Ruth were doing fine along with Naomi, and then the sons died, and the husband died. And all of a sudden, here are three women, 2/3 of them in homeland, and 1/3 not in her homeland, and things were not going well. It was a very difficult time for Naomi and her two daughters-in-law. So Naomi decided she would head back to the homeland, back across that troublesome river. The Jordan was a troublesome river. Come on. It was not, it was a boundary. It was a border. She went back home. But on the way, they ran into some, disagreements, because Naomi said, look, y'all are from Moab. Y'all stay here. I'm going back to where my home is. Well, Orpah decided that she would indeed go back. And during this chapter of Ruth, there's a lot of turning. Turn back, turn and go. The word turn is very prominent through this chapter of Ruth. It's a significant word because it was more than just a curve. It was turning to cross culture, border, home, past home. It was turning to do something quite differently. And it was difficult for all of them. And this is where we are probably most familiar with the book of Ruth. Because at this point in the story, Ruth decided she would go with her mother-in-law. And that's where we hear this that's sometimes used in weddings. And it's usually, unfortunately, can we say that it's usually the woman who's going to follow the man? Can we say that's how this goes in a wedding? And it's, don't press me to leave you or to turn back from following you? And I remember it as, whither thou goest, I will go. That's King James language. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. And so Ruth, with that declaration to her mother-in-law, goes with Naomi back home for Naomi. Now remember that it went pretty well for Naomi and her sons and husband for a while. They apparently were reasonably well received in Moab. Then when they went back to Bethlehem, they were also well received. It was a kind of a bittersweet homecoming. In fact, Naomi asked that her name be changed to Mara, which is about bitterness, and she just kind of lost it. Here she is back home. She doesn't have anything. She doesn't have her husband. She doesn't have her sons, and she's got one daughter-in-law. So that's the end of the first chapter. Well, there are 4 chapters. It's not going to take as long to do the last 3 as to do the first one. Okay? Good. Hang in. Hang in. They began to scheme. Now, imagine sweet Naomi, now wanting to be called mine, beginning to scheme. You see, there's a family member of hers, or her husband, it's not really clear, but there's some family there, and there's some inheritance there. But more than that, they're just hungry. So Naomi sends Ruth out to do some gleaning. Now, one of the pictures that I remember from my home church and my grandma's church, and it was usually in a women's Sunday school classroom, but it was the gleaners. And it's a picture of Ruth gleaning. Now, gleaning is a tough job. You go into the field and you follow along behind the bundles of grain that are being put together, and you stoop over and you pick up what's left, the leftovers. Some are on stalks, and some, frankly, are just picking up grains. And that picture of the gleaning is a powerful part of being a woman in 20th century Protestantism. Okay? And that's where those pictures come from. So here's Ruth gleaning, and she's apparently you have to be kind of careful, because there are people who take advantage of the gleaners. And as she gleans, she begins to pick some stuff up, and finally she gets enough, to take home, and it's barley. I don't know what difference that makes, but it's barley, and she takes her gleanings home the first night, and then she begins to tell Naomi, now Mari, about her experiences. And it turns out that Ruth just happens to have been gleaning in the field of this family member who, the whole inheritance business. So Naomi begins to give Ruth some instruction about how to do this. And she tells her to, stay close to those women who are part of this family member. His name is Boaz. Stay close in there and be careful. So Ruth goes again, and this time she catches the eye of Boaz. Imagine that. And we're not told in the story exactly that at this point Naomi's got her eye on Boaz for Ruth, but it begins to to look a little suspicious. And so Boaz begins to notice Ruth and tells her to be careful. And, oh, by the way, if you need some water, go where my people are drinking. And after they've drunk, you have some water. Invites her to lunch. I'm not kidding. Boaz invites her to lunch. Here's what lunch sounds like near the threshing floor. It's after Boaz compliments her a great deal, because she begins to hear how she came. I mean, he asks his people, who's that woman? And it begins to be told. And then at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some of this bread and dip your morsel in the sour wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain, and she ate it. So that's what I mean. She was invited to lunch. And Boaz has begun to take interest in her. Move the story forward another few hours, and Naomi, new name, has given Ruth some instruction. She says, clean up, put on your best clothes, put on a little scent, and when Boaz goes to sleep near the pile of grain, I want you to sidle up to him is not exactly what she said. But, okay, this is not something you learned in Sunday school. This is not something you learned in Sunday school. I guarantee you that I went through Sunday school in two different Sunday schools, one at Metropolitan Avenue and one at Bucyrus, my grandma's church. I did not learn this. But there are Hebrew words that give this story some R-rated implications. Now, are you paying attention here? I said implications. It goes this way. When you talk about feet, the Hebrew word for feet may cover anything from the waist down. I'm depending on Kathleen for this. Remember the female scholar that I mentioned earlier? I don't want you to think I just made this up. Feet has wider implications than those things at the end of our legs with toes on them. In addition, in this story, at one point, Ruth and Boaz began to talk about the Lord spreading his wings over to cover. Well, there is a spiritual element to covering, and there are some implications for covering, and it has to do with covering and uncovering. So when Naomi tells Ruth to go after Boaz has been satisfied at dinner with his food and his wine, and when he has gone to sleep, she is to go, she's to go to the threshing floor by the heap of grain where he is sleeping the night to guard his grain, and she is to uncover his feet, and he's still asleep. You're just going to have to use your wildest imaginations, if you wish, or not, about this story. At this point, when Boaz wakes up, he says, "There's a woman here." And he begins to talk with her, and he's complimentary of her. And he says, "Now, when you leave here, do it while it's still dark." And then he is close to the grain. He has her hold her cloak out, and he puts 6 measures of barley. I don't know how much that is. Sounds like a bunch. puts it in her cloak, and she folds it up, puts it on her back, and she goes home. Before she goes home, he says, I think we need to work on something here having to do with this inheritance thing. I'll take care of it. She goes home. Naomi says, just sit tight. We'll wait and see how this works out. Boaz goes to the city gate, main gate of Bethlehem, where he meets a relative who has a first right of redemption for the equity that seems to be a part of Ruth and Naomi's life. There's a right of redemption. Now, in the sense that the first chapter has a lot of turns in it, the last chapter has a lot of redeemed in it. And those two are kind of like bookends in this story. So in the redemption, Boaz says to the relative who has first call on redeeming the property, I don't want to go into all of that Middle Eastern Hebrew how you do this thing, but he says to the relative, you got right of first redemption. Why don't you buy this? Naomi's back. You can buy it from her. And he said, yeah, I can do that. And Boaz says, oh, by the way, Ruth comes with the deal. Well, he said, I can't do that. That messes up my own inheritance. Messes up my own life. You can have it. Boaz says in front of the 10 elders that he's gathered there, he says, we're going to do it. You heard the man? The man gives him his sandal, which is the Middle Eastern sign for done deal, and it's a done deal. And Ruth and Boaz live happily ever after. So did we skip all the messy parts? Now, that's an earthy story. Kathleen sees this story as a parable. You know Jesus' parable, like the story of the Good Samaritan. And at the end, Jesus, puts it to him and says, and who was neighbor to the one who fell among thieves? And it was a trick question. It was a hard question because the Samaritan was despised. Parables are used in the Old Testament as well. Nathan told the story to David. And at the end of it, David's all upset. Oh, we ought to get that guy. And Nathan says, you are that man. Now, in this parable, there's no kicker. This parable just stands there. And we, in the time when this parable could have some important meaning for us in our world, in our time, in our church, may need to make up the kicker for ourselves. Because we have a geographical diversity. We have hospitality offered at both ends of a geographical difficulty. We have a woman who goes with her mother-in-law and says, your people will be my people, and your gods will be my gods. Actually, it's singular. Your God will be my God. So here we have a parable that, if we look at it closely, is very pungent. It's pushy. And we don't have Jesus here to say, this is you. We don't have Nathan here to say, that man was you. So, Ron's not going to leave this sermon hanging like he does every now and then and say, you figure it out. You take a look at what this is and what we're doing here in our society, in our church, and in our lives to say, what part of that story is for me to hear? What part of the geographical displacement and movement with hospitality is mine to hear? So, when you're talking about geographical hospitality, you got to go through Ruth.